the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works in the Mojave Desert. For over 50 years, the Skunk Works is the place where America's super-secret spy planes are built and tested. In 1954, a CIA contingent arrives at the original Skunk Works building in Burbank, California. They are there on a classified mission called Wild Cherry.
Where there was so much of the Soviet Union that was sealed off, inaccessible, and photo reconnaissance became an absolutely essential tool to see what was beyond the Iron Curtain.
What was needed was technical intelligence collection, and this meant high-altitude, specialized reconnaissance aircraft that could fly over the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, photograph targets with impunity because they were above the reach of Soviet air defenses.
But the CIA needs much more than that. Operation Wild Cherry is about carrying out death-defying recon missions, including inserting and recovering secret agents behind the Iron Curtain.
The Air Force, as a rule of thumb, had modified military aircraft to conduct reconnaissance. So you took a bomber and you just stripped it, changed the bomb bay out, and put cameras in, or that kind of thing.
The converted Air Force bombers lacked the facilities the CIA needed. Instead, the agency turned to the U.S. Navy for just the right aircraft, a long-range patrol bomber called the Lockheed Neptune.
The CIA picked the Neptune both because it was designed to operate at low altitudes, and the various missions such as agent drops or leaflet drops required flying at very low altitude, under 100 feet, in fact in some cases down around 30 feet above the ground.
The Neptune was the only aircraft that fitted the particular profile for what they wanted to do with it, which was some pretty odd things, and they needed a good solid aeroplane that could fly quite slowly.
In assessing the Neptune as a reconnaissance vehicle, I think was really outstanding. It was an outstanding aircraft. The fact that it could go low and stay on station for such a long period of time gave it tremendous value as a collection platform. So in that respect, I think it was outstanding.
Project Wild Cherry moves ahead. 7 new Neptunes are hand-built in Lockheed's Skunk Works facility, also known as RB-69s. These aircraft push the bounds of technology.
The RB-69, which was the CIA version of the Neptune, the cover designation for it, was also the first aircraft to carry a side-looking radar. And this was mounted along the side of the aircraft, and it would transmit a fan-shaped signal at right angles to the airplane. The echoes would be picked up, and these could be converted into images that almost look like pictures. And it could operate at night, in bad weather, so it was much less vulnerable to interception.
But really what makes this aircraft stand out is that it features an aerial retrieval system that allows an aircraft in flight to snare an agent standing on the ground and winch him back on board. The device is called a skyhook.
The skyhook system was invented by a man named Fulton. He was an inventive genius. He built a, we would call it a flying car in the immediate post-war period. And in the course of flight testing this aircraft, he thought about how he would be rescued if the plane went down. And from this, the skyhook system emerged. And basically what it was a fork mounted on the nose of an aircraft.
By 1958, Fulton's skyhook had taken its final shape. A package that could easily be dropped from an aircraft contained the necessary ground equipment. It featured a harness for cargo or a person. It was attached to a 500-foot, high-strength nylon line. A portable helium bottle inflated a dirigible-shaped balloon, raising the line to its full height.
The person being rescued would wear a harness that was attached to a long line. At the end of the line was a balloon. The airplane would fly along, catch the line in the fork, and there was a device called a sky anchor that would simultaneously catch the line and release the balloon. The person would be rather gently lifted off the ground and accelerated to flying speed. And people who have done this, who were picked up, really enjoyed the experience. It was a lot of fun.
The first successful pickup took place on August 12, 1958. The guinea pig was Marine Corps Sergeant Levi W. Woods, who described the initial contact as similar to a kick in the pants. The Neptune, with its skyhook, is ready for its first recovery.
The first operational recovery was a joint CIA Defense Intelligence Agency operation called Operation Cold Feet. 2 intelligence officers were airdropped from a B-17 into an abandoned Soviet ice station. They spent several days there recovering documents, code books, equipment, photographing the facilities, analyzing it, and then they were picked up using the skyhook along with the materials they had recovered, again using the B-17. And this was done in very poor visibility with very strong wind. As they were being picked up, the wind caught the balloon, and they were actually being dragged across the ice as they were awaiting the pickup.
Operation Wild Cherry is now ready to go into full deployment, but an unexpected problem trips up the rollout. The CIA needs a credible cover story if any of its Neptunes are lost on a mission.
They tried very hard to get the Navy to cover for them. They wanted to put Navy markings on these Neptunes so they would never get blamed if they got lost. And by the way, when one got lost, it was serious because there were 12 guys on board. It was a very serious business to put up that many people at risk.
Carlos Campbell was a crewman on conventional U.S. Navy Neptunes flying close to Red China and North Korea. He knew the dangers if his aircraft went down.
We got in a little trouble because we were jumped by a MiG coming probably out of North Korea. And the North Koreans were kind of crazy. They were trigger happy.
Ultimately, losing a spy plane with Navy markings is too hot to handle for the Navy.
The Navy, after thinking about it, absolutely refused, because the whole proposition was endangering their Neptunes. Because once the CIA started flying penetration missions into these countries, all these countries would be gunning for any Neptune they ever saw.
The Navy's pullback forces the CIA to come up with a new cover story. It persuades the U.S. Air Force to let the agency fly Neptunes with Air Force markings. The Air Force pretends the new planes are radar trainers. The first 2 are sent to Wiesbaden in West Germany and begin to roll on recon missions over Eastern Europe. The timing couldn't be better. In August 1961, the communist regime in East Germany isolates the 3 sectors in West Berlin under Allied control and begins building the Berlin Wall. President Kennedy declares he is prepared to go to war to protect West Berlin. Neptune missions behind the Iron Curtain are stepped up in an effort to probe Soviet battle readiness.
The agent drop missions, they were flown at very low altitude at night, deep into communist territory. In some cases, the round trip would take 12 or 13 hours. They were flown at as low as 30-foot altitudes. They were very dangerous, but they were very rarely intercepted.
To this day, the identities of the Neptune crews and agents they serviced is a closely guarded secret.
These missions were flown by exiled Eastern European pilots. They were Polish pilots, Czech pilots who'd flown for the RAF. They were stateless persons. They were refugees. The U.S. and the British government could disown them if the planes were shot down.
Intelligence gathered by Wild Cherry flights is invaluable in undermining Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Russia backs down in the confrontation over West Berlin. But Soviet spies infiltrate the Wild Cherry operation.
These type of operations simply would not work against a police state such as the Soviet Union, China, and also because there were major leaks in the operations. These were both low-level double agents and people like Kim Philby, who were at the heart of the operations and were able to betray them from the beginning to the Soviets.
By 1963, the Wild Cherry missions over Eastern Europe are so badly compromised they are shut down. The 2 Neptunes based in Europe are now sent to join the other 5 CIA Neptunes based in Taiwan. Flown by Taiwanese crews, their mission is to penetrate communist China and maintain a resistance network against Mao Zedong's regime.
The reconnaissance war against China has always taken a sort of slightly secondary seat to the Soviet Union, but was in many ways equally as important. It was vital to know what the Chinese were doing. They were behind the developments in nuclear technology that the Soviets were, but they were getting there. So by the mid-50s, they're beginning to do things that are seen as a threat to NATO and the Allies. So it was very important that we knew what was going on.
The Neptune flights over China are the most dangerous spy flights of the entire Cold War.
The Chinese knew what was going on. They tracked the aircraft. They frequently captured the agents, so they were able to interrogate them.
Over 80 penetrations of Chinese airspace are conducted between 1958 and 1964, often dropping agents by parachute and recovering later by skyhook. Flights are conducted as far as Mao's capital at Beijing.
So they knew what was going on. They knew who was sponsoring the missions, who was, what the missions were for, and so forth. But they could do very little about it. They couldn't intercept the aircraft, except in very rare occasions.
In an attempt to catch the Neptunes, the Chinese devised one of the first airborne early warning systems, using a Russian version of the B-29. The Tupolev Tu-4.
One tactic they used against the Neptune successfully was to determine where it was and then drop flares. And the idea was to illuminate the broad landscape so the airplane would be visible and then send MiGs to shoot it down.
In the end, 5 CIA Neptunes are shot down or disappear under mysterious circumstances. Were the Wild Cherry missions successful in bringing back secret agents and their photographs from behind the Iron Curtain? Carlos Campbell was a senior analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency during the 1960s.
Well, the only thing I can say indirectly as an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency, 65 forward, I had the benefit of photography, not just from satellites, but from other sources. So somebody had to be doing some flying somewhere.
In 1952, U.S. intelligence agencies learn about the construction of a secret rocket test facility in a remote part of the Soviet Union called Kapustin Yar. The Air Force does not possess a reconnaissance plane able to reach Kapustin Yar and return safely. The hunt begins to find a new spy plane, a hunt that ultimately ends up in Britain. Kapustin Yar on the Volga River east of Stalingrad. Here in the early 1950s, Russia's legendary rocket engineer, Sergei Korolev, is developing technology to put a Russian in space. But it's not the only project Korolev's team is working on.
Kapustin Yar was the Soviets' main ballistic missile test site in the first half of the 50s. That's where they tested their initial battlefield missiles, and then later the SS-3s and SS-4s, which were designed to strike targets in Western Europe and Asia from the Soviet Union.
Kapustin Yar was probably the most important target for military intelligence. The greatest threat, they realized, was going to come from the Russian development of what we'd known as the V-2 rockets during the Second World War.
America and NATO are desperate to get photographs of the facility.
Those photographs would have been invaluable because from them it would have allowed intelligence agencies to work out exactly how far the Soviets had got in the development of long-range missiles.
But there's a problem. The U.S. Air Force lacks an aircraft that can fly high enough, long enough, and fast enough to photograph the facility at Kapustin Yar without being intercepted. Fortunately, the British RAF has just such a plane. It's called the English Electric Canberra.
The Canberra had a big broad wing and could get to 55,000 feet. And with extra rocket engines or with a bigger wing, it could get to unprecedented heights, 65,000 feet plus. This is really useful because when you're up against foreign defenses and surface-to-air missiles were just coming in then, you want to fly as high as you could.
Oh, I do it all the time.
Really? You guys meet? Greg, Janice?
We sure did.
That was stupid.
Great.
This is Smart, a beeper service for just $1.99 a month. From who else? Smart Beep. Call 1-800-BEEP-199 for other smart stuff, like directions.
We've got chemistry here. You feel it?
I felt it.
Pretty well the best.
But the Canberra is useless without an effective spy camera. As luck would have it, a revolutionary camera is under development at Boston University. The camera is 10 feet long. Its code name is Robin. Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill now agrees to an extraordinary secret mission to photograph Kapustin Yar. An RAF Canberra flies to Hanscom Air Force Base near Boston, Massachusetts, where it is fitted with the Robin camera. By the summer of 1953, everything is ready for a run at the Soviet rocket testing range. The RAF Canberra takes off from Giebelstadt in West Germany, then thunders into Soviet airspace. It is immediately picked up on Soviet radar, and MiG fighters scramble to intercept it.
One of the mystery missions of this era was the Canberra flight to photograph the Soviet missile site at Kapustin Yar. There hasn't been any paperwork discovered. There are people who've seen the pictures, described them.
The Canberra streaks past Kapustin Yar, taking hundreds of detailed photographs of the rocket base.
The aircraft was damaged in the course of the mission, but survived and recovered in Iran.
The United States Air Force is impressed with the British Canberra and orders the Martin Company to build an American version called the RB-57.
What the Air Force did was put extended wings on it to further improve its altitude capability. And these were used for both border photographic flights and also for overflights of the Soviet Union.
It was modified with much longer wings and larger power plants. And this allowed it to achieve an altitude of about 65,000 feet.
20 of the long-wing RB-57Ds are built. They form a special reconnaissance unit of Strategic Air Command. The head of SAC, General Curtis LeMay, wants to use them to fly over the Soviet Union to scout potential targets, especially Russian bomber bases. LeMay also wants a brand new jet reconnaissance plane to fly higher than any other aircraft. For security reasons, the aircraft will be known as the X-16.
The Bell Company came up with a concept for the so-called X-16, a cover designation, an X-series designation to cover a reconnaissance program. This would have been a twin-engine airplane looking sort of like a Super B-57, but with very broad wings.
The Bell X-16 was an aircraft designed for high-altitude reconnaissance for the Air Force. It was an exception to the pattern in that this was the first post-war aircraft specifically designed for reconnaissance.
The outstanding X-16 has enormous swept-back wings, measuring 114 feet from tip to tip. These will allow the X-16 to reach an altitude of over 70,000 feet. Under each wing is a powerful jet engine. In 1956, the first prototype is 80% complete. But unknown to the U.S. Air Force and the Bell Corporation, the X-16 has a secret rival. It is being built at the same time at the Lockheed Skunk Works by legendary aircraft designer Kelly Johnson. Once again, the CIA is involved, and the project will have the support of no less than the President of the United States himself. In March 1954, the U.S. Air Force commissioned a new spy plane as a successor to the RB-57. The new aircraft, designated the X-16, was being built by the Bell Aircraft Company and was being designed to fly at altitudes that no other aircraft could reach. But even as the designs were being turned into reality, the project was plunged into crisis.
They were starting to build the mock-ups and all the rest of it when Kelly Johnson, who hadn't been invited to participate in the X-16 competition, brought his design to the table. It was an F-104 body with super long wings. They were bolt-on wings, each with 4 bolts. It was a jet-powered glider, basically.
Johnson's rival to the X-16 also has a misleading designation. It is called the Lockheed U-2, the U standing for utility. Unlike the X-16, the U-2 is a CIA project, and it has the personal backing of President Eisenhower.
President Dwight Eisenhower was central to the development of U.S. Cold War aerial reconnaissance. He approved the early overflights using RB-47s. He approved development of the U-2.
Eisenhower wanted intelligence he could rely on, intelligence that was not dominated and directed by purely military concerns.
He understood how important aerial reconnaissance was from his experience as Supreme Allied Commander, and he was very upset at the level of intelligence he was getting as president on the Soviet Union. It was far inferior to what he had enjoyed as Allied commander in World War II.
As president, it was Eisenhower who had decided that intelligence should be under the control of a civilian agency.
Eisenhower broke with tradition in that reconnaissance was traditionally a military task. What he did was to put it under the control of the CIA.
Immediately, the CIA began to derail the X-16 project in favor of their own plane, the modified Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. Logic is on their side.
The X-16 was a twin-engine aircraft. And senior Air Force officials liked that because they had been bomber pilots and they had made it back when one engine was shot out. The problem was that if the X-16 lost an engine, it was going to come down. It could not maintain its altitude. And once it started down, it lost its only defense.
It was also very helpful the fact that LeMay and the US Air Force had pretty well rejected the U-2 as a joke. LeMay had laughed at it because it didn't have guns and it wasn't a classic military aircraft. In fact, it was ideally designed for the task in hand.
The first U-2 is delivered to a secret airbase at Groom Lake, Nevada on July 25, 1955. The Bell X-16 is canceled before the first plane can fly. It is a bitter blow to the Air Force.
The problem was that with the X-16, they were designing an airplane to fulfill a mission. What Kelly Johnson realized was he needed to reverse the process. The mission would design the airplane. The U-2 had everything it needed to do to perform its mission, fly at 70,000 feet plus and photograph the Soviet Union. It didn't have anything it didn't need to perform that mission.
The first CIA U-2 spy flight over the Soviet Union takes place in June 1956. But General LeMay is not going to give up without a fight. In November 1956, he orders 6 of his RB-57D Canberra reconnaissance planes flying from bases in Japan to make a simultaneous penetration of the Soviet Union. President Eisenhower is furious. In December, he bans all Soviet flyovers by the U.S. Air Force. From now on, only the CIA's U-2s are allowed to fly spy missions over Russia. But the story of the RB-57 isn't over.
There were still a lot of other reconnaissance functions that needed to be dealt with, and the RB-57 was an ideal platform to do that.
The advantage the RB-57 has over the U-2 is that it's a bigger machine and can carry much more in the way of electronic spying equipment. In the early 1960s, the Air Force orders an improved model of the Canberra, the RB-57F.
The span of the Canberra from tip to tip was about 65 feet. The RB-57F, the span was over 122 feet, just about double. They also put new engines on, big Pratt & Whitney turbofans, TF-33s, and they put extra little jet engines under the wings, J-60s. And next minute you had a Canberra that you could fly to 75,000, maybe 78,000 feet. I think the figure may even be classified, but it was certainly the highest flying aeroplane in the world at that time.
Even the CIA comes to recognize the usefulness of the Canberra. In 1958, the agency sponsors a program known as Diamond Lil, under which Chinese nationalist pilots are trained to fly RB-57Ds, as well as the older Neptunes.
The Republic of China on Taiwan, beginning during the Korean War, was furnished aircraft by the Air Force and conducted overflights of the mainland. There were RF-84s, eventually RB-57s, eventually U-2s.
But what these recon missions reveal is disturbing. The nationalist Chinese Canberras prove that China has developed its own atomic weapons. The Chinese Canberras would expose one more communist secret, one that would foreshadow disaster.
The Chinese air defenses start to get themselves quite seriously together by the mid to late 50s, and they're beginning to take out RB-57s and ultimately U-2s that are flying over their territory.
On October 7th, 1959, an RB-57D, piloted by Captain Ying-Chin Wang, is on a mission over the Chinese mainland, when suddenly his aircraft is rocked by a thunderous explosion. Wang's Canberra is the first aircraft ever to be downed in combat by a surface-to-air missile.
When the RB-57s were first given to the Chinese nationalists, it was very dangerous because the SAM SA-2 surface-to-air missiles were online, and the Soviets had begun to furnish them to the Chinese People's Republic. And in fact, an RB-57 was shot down about 2 or 3 months before Francis Gary Power, but they didn't realize what had brought it down at the time. Had they known that it was a surface-to-air missile, they might have thought differently about the U-2 missions.
The tiny single-engined U-2s continue to fly alone over Soviet Russia. It is only a matter of time before what happened to Captain Wang's RB-57 happens to the U-2. Tokyo, Japan, as U.S. and NATO spy planes brazenly probed Soviet airspace during the 1950s and 60s. The Russians launched their own reconnaissance program. Fast Soviet jets carrying cameras regularly fly over Japan, often buzzing Tokyo itself. In Europe, Soviet planes stray out of the designated flight corridors to look at NATO bases in West Germany. Soviet commercial airliners often carry secret cameras to photograph NATO bases under their path. Nothing is out of their reach. Not even the U.S.
I think it's reasonable to suppose that the Soviet Union conducted aerial reconnaissance over this country using Aeroflot vehicles and, of course, the Bear bombers that flew down the coast to Cuba. There were instances in the 1950s when some of the Tu-4 B-29 copies entered Alaskan airspace and had to be escorted out.
But the Soviet Air Force still lacks a dedicated spy plane comparable to the American and British versions. Work begins in 1957 on a project to create an aircraft that can operate at high altitudes to evade interception.
The Yak-25 was an all-weather fighter. Then it was developed over the next few years into bomber versions, reconnaissance versions, including the RV, which was a very high-altitude reconnaissance version.
What they did, they took away the sharply swept short-span wing, and they put on a wing like a sailplane. Tremendous long-span, graceful wing like a U-2. And before you knew it, they had the Yak-25RV, RV being Russian initials for extreme altitude.
It's a single cockpit aircraft. It was devoid of armament, and it had powerful engines that would allow it to operate at very high altitudes.
Test flights begin in March 1959. Immediately, problems arise.
The Yak-25 is sort of a cross between the U-2 and the X-16. It has the same problem with as the X-16 has, in that it's a fairly conventional airplane. So it's not as efficient as the U-2.
At altitudes above 60,000 feet, the physics of flight are rewritten. A window of only 10 miles per hour exists to fly the plane. Any faster, and you will tear off the long, thin wings. Any slower, and you could tumble out of the ultra-thin air. Reconnaissance pilots call this Coffin Corner. The Mandrake's poor engineering makes it especially prone to disaster in Coffin Corner. But the Red Air Force has no other options, so the Mandrake is ordered into production, even though it lacks the range to reach the United States.
The Yak-25 really had nowhere worth going because the Soviets were...
I'm wild and I am free. Come on, baby, you belong to me. Sweet kiss makes my engine start. Well, I'm wild and I am free. Come on, baby, you belong to me. Sweet kiss makes my engine start. The way you move, you own my heart. Sweet kiss makes my engine start. The way you move, you own my heart.
Reconnoitering Western Europe because they knew all about it.
The Soviets will not have long to wait to get a closer look at Western spy technology. On May 1st, 1960, a CIA U-2 will go missing on a flight over the Soviet Union. Its pilot is Francis Gary Powers, and it is the 24th U-2 spy flight over the Soviet Union. Powers' U-2 will be hit by a Soviet SA-2 ground-to-air missile while flying at 70,500 feet. Just 6 months after an SA-2 downed a Taiwanese RB-57D, flown by Captain Wang.
It was a coup as far as international relations were concerned. It also showed the US military the extent to which they had underestimated the performance of Soviet anti-aircraft missiles.
Powers is put on public trial and sentenced to 10 years for spying. But there is an unexpected twist to the Powers flight that we can now reveal. What remained of Powers' U-2 after the surface-to-air missile hit is scattered over hundreds of miles. The Soviet High Command orders a massive search for every piece of the downed aircraft in a desperate bid to learn its secrets. Thousands of Soviet troops take part in the hunt.
It's quite remarkable how close the Soviets kept up with American technology during the 50s and 60s. And they did this by the simple expedient of trying to steal all the American secrets. Basically, they let the capitalists do all the work and do all the research. When they worked out what the best alloys were or what the best equipment was, the Russians would somehow get the specifications or steal the item, and then they would reverse engineer it. So they were often just slightly behind.
The U-2 parts are gathered together and carefully studied. Angry that Russia's own Mandrake is far inferior to the U-2, Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev orders the Soviet aircraft industry to manufacture a copy of the American spy plane. On April 1st, 1961, less than a year after the downing of Powers' U-2, a detailed metal fuselage mock-up is ready. The mission profile of the Soviet U-2 copy is also expanded. One task will be to hunt and destroy hostile balloons, carrying cameras that the Americans release at high altitudes over the Soviet Union.
We tried to use long-range balloons, where balloons were released in Europe and then drifted across the Soviet heartland and then were recovered in the Western Pacific. And sometimes you got useful information, but far more often you got nothing at all.
One of the problems with it was that one of these high-altitude balloons floating at 60 or 70,000 feet will be illuminated by the sun when the ground is in darkness. So you have this giant silvery object in the sky. They frequently flash green or red or orange, and people immediately thought it was the aliens. These were a leading cause of flying saucer sightings, and they attracted a whole lot of attention. The other factor was that there were development problems, and occasionally they would come crashing down. And in one case, a complete reconnaissance balloon package came down in a Denver suburb.
But the Soviet U-2 soon runs into trouble. The weight of the Soviet copy of the U-2 begins to climb. It will not be able to reach 70,000 feet, the altitude of the original American version. In May 1962, the project to copy the U-2 is suddenly canceled. Back in America, even before the shooting down of Gary Powers' U-2, the CIA looks for a more radical solution to the problem of Soviet radar detection. The result would be a marvel in aviation history: stealth parasitic aircraft. In the late summer of 1956, CIA officials visit a number of airframe contractors in a search for new ideas for a U-2 replacement. The result is the birth of stealth technology.
About 2 years into the program, about 1958, it was realized that Soviet air defenses were catching up with the U-2. Eisenhower was somewhat reluctant to authorize missions, and it was clear that they needed an aircraft with higher performance. The U-2 flew at subsonic speeds. In fact, its top speed was not that different than World War II fighters, a little over 400 knots. If an aircraft could be built that could fly at 90,000 feet, at 3 times the speed of sound, it would essentially be unstoppable.
The search for a new aircraft was narrowed to 2 firms: Lockheed Aircraft, designers of the U-2, and the Convair division of General Dynamics, builder of the supersonic B-58 Hustler bomber for the Air Force. By late summer 1959, both Convair and Lockheed have completed design studies for the new spy plane. Convair's entry is known as the Kingfish. Its design uses much of the B-58 Hustler technology, including a crew capsule system, which eliminates the need for the flight crew to wear a pressurized suit. The Kingfish has 2 side-by-side J-58 engines inside the fuselage, which significantly reduces the radar cross-section. Lockheed's new entry is called the Archangel 12, or A-12. It also employs 2 of the powerful J-58 engines.
The power plant of both the Convair and the Lockheed design was very unusual. This was a turbo ramjet engine, and the result was very particular. At high speed, it functioned more like a ramjet than a conventional jet engine. Most of the air didn't go through the engine, it went around it and was heated by the afterburner.
On August 20th, 1959, Lockheed and Convair submit their proposals to a joint Department of Defense, Air Force, and CIA selection panel. In the vital area of vulnerability to radar detection, the Convair design is judged superior. Its smaller size and internally mounted engines give it a smaller potential radar cross-section than the Lockheed A-12. CIA representatives favor the Convair Kingfish. But the long conflict between the CIA and the U.S. Air Force over reconnaissance planes is about to produce a new twist.
Convair had a problem in this competition, and the problem was the B-58. The B-58 was a very complex, very expensive, and very unreliable airplane.
The Air Force believes Convair's history of cost overruns and delays on the B-58 Hustler project will repeat itself under this new project. Lockheed, by contrast, produced the U-2 under budget and on time. So the U.S. Air Force representatives persuade the CIA to pick the Lockheed proposal. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird is the fastest and highest flying combat plane of all time. During their 24 years of operational service, Blackbirds fly 3,551 reconnaissance missions without a single aircraft being shot down.
Here was an airplane designed in the 1958-1961 time period, first flown in prototype form in 1962, first flown in all up ability to do its job in 1963 and 64, and it is staggeringly advanced by the standards of aircraft design at the time.
Not everything goes smoothly with the SR-71 program. Just 3 years after the Blackbird starts flying operational missions, the Soviets will capture a version of this revolutionary aircraft. In October 1962, barely 6 months after the first flight of the Blackbird, the CIA gives the green light for the next evolution of the spy plane. This miniature version of the Blackbird uses the same engine and stealth technology. Designed as an unmanned spy aircraft, it will be carried to altitude by a B-52 mothership and launched over dangerous reconnaissance targets. It's the first parasitic stealth aircraft in history. It is called the D-21, D standing for daughter.
The D-21 was an effort to avoid the problem that both the U-2 and the SR-71 had, in that they were both manned aircraft. If you fly an unmanned aircraft, there's going to be political consequences, but they're going to be a lot smaller than if you have a dead or captured pilot.
The D-21 is a stovepipe with a cone in its inlet. Wings run the length of the stovepipe, making the D-21 look like a flying manta ray. Like the A-12, the D-21 is made of titanium and radar-absorbing plastic composites. But the D-21 proves an expensive disaster. 2 are lost in missions over China, and 2 are lost on the return.
They'd flown 4 missions over China, and they'd all failed. They got no data back.
But the D-21 has an amazing finale, nearly a quarter of a century later. When Ben Rich, head of Lockheed's famous Skunk Works, visits Russia in the 1990s after the fall of communism, he is handed a mysterious package. It contains parts of a crashed U.S. aircraft. The parts turn out to be from the D-21 that disappeared on the very first operational flight over a quarter of a century earlier. The missing D-21 had veered off course and crashed in Russian Siberia. But by an amazing stroke of luck, the Soviets do not connect the smaller D-21 with the Blackbird, and they fail to appreciate the significance of the drone's technology. When the United States stood down its Blackbirds, it was not the end of the U.S. manned reconnaissance flights. Some 50 years after its first flight, the U-2 is still flying secret missions, most recently in both Afghanistan and Iraq.
The U-2 has proved to be remarkably resilient reconnaissance platform. And as a subsonic vehicle, its cost per flying hour is very reasonable compared to the SR-71, which was just incredible.
Flying reconnaissance missions will always be a dangerous game.
You don't do that for the glory, but you know that what you're doing is very valuable. And even in today's environment, we have to maintain vigilance over potential adversaries.
The deadly superpower spying game continues. As the flight patch motto on today's U-2 crews read, "In God we trust, all others we monitor."